Welcome everybody to Paleo Talks. We are on episode 58 and really excited to have with us today Riley Black. How are you doing, Riley?
I'm doing good. How are you today, Blaine?
Doing really well. And as you said earlier, it's Friday. So it's always Friday on Paleo Talks, isn't it? So we're usually really happy. Although we love our job.
Every day Fossil Friday, right?
Yeah, true. Well, we're so lucky in paleontology that we're usually happy. But usually. Anyway,
except reviewer two.
Reviewer two. Well, that's for sure. Reviewer two can be evil. So how you doing, David?
Doing well. Happy to be here.
And Chris down there too. You're in the bottom left for me. And the way we always start out is at first David's going to tell us everybody a little bit about how the show works again, just as a reminder, and then we'll come back and have Riley introduce herself a little bit more with her background, and then get started with the presentation. Go ahead, David.
All right. So anyone out there who's a regular will recognize the format, same as usual. Here in just a little bit after introducing our guest, we're going to go into our main presentation, which is about the weird cat thing, Patriaphilis. Very excited to have Riley here. I've been a fan of Riley for a long time. So it's exciting to get opportunities to be involved in projects like this together. And then once the presentation is done, we're going to spend the rest of the time doing Q&A. So we here on the Zoom call might have some questions, but we'll also open it up to people in the audience to ask questions for our guest, at which point you can put your questions in the comments of the Facebook video. And as always, if for any reason you can't leave a comment on Facebook, I'll be keeping an eye on the Gray Fossil site, Twitter and Instagram accounts. You can send us your questions there as well.
All right, thank you, David. Just a reminder, we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University, where we oversee the research at the Gray Fossil site. And Riley, you just visited recently. What do you think of the site and museum here?
Oh, it's phenomenal. I've been wanting to visit for years and years and years. I'm glad I finally made good on my promise to Chris to get out there, even if it was first thing in the morning. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, when you think about these places, like most of the places I go for field work, and you'll see a little bit of this in the talk, it's out in the desert somewhere, miles away from anything. So to have something right there, like basically your version of La Brea, and to have it be like just about as rich in detail was just, it was mind-blowing. Like I need to come back basically, and I will get back there.
Yeah,
and stay a lot longer.
Anytime.
Yeah, stay a lot longer for sure.
Stay in the pit for a little bit.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, thank you for that advertisement. That was also wonderful. Well, again, it's just wonderful to have you. Good to see you. And what we do is we just sort of have you introduce yourself, Riley, and tell us about your background in paleontology, how you got interested in it, and then sort of where you're at now. And then we'll lead right into the presentation.
Sure. So my main career is as a science writer and journalist. So I've written, what is it? This is like tattoos. I need to like count and remember like how many books I've done at this point. I think it's 8. I think 8 different books. Some are trade publications like My Beloved Brontosaurus and Skeleton Keys. I just finished The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, which will be out in April. And I've done some other books. So I think I've got the newest one with me that's just out this fall. This is Deep Time. So it's 50 different little vignettes, concepts, ideas about the depth of time from the origin of the universe through, a couple thousand years ago. And I write for a variety of publications. I've written for, Slate, Science, Smithsonian, Scientific American, other places that don't start with S. But really anywhere that needs a fossil story, I'm generally on it. I really enjoy following the fossil beat. And even though folks might associate me with dinosaurs the most, I really love lately getting a bit more into the Cenozoic and writing about some more Ice Age stuff. I just did a story for New Scientist last week that there's now evidence that some giant ground sloths incorporate a fair amount of meat into their diet. Not all of them, but some of them, and that's pretty cool. It's been really good in the past couple of years for Ice Age research. So that's the main part of my career. And then that flexibility, being a freelancer, allows me to go out in the field. So I volunteer with lots of different museum and university crews. I've done field work everywhere from Denali National Park in Alaska to El Golfo in northern Mexico. Most of my stuff is in the American Southwest, in Utah and the surrounding area. But it's one of those things where there's no substitute really for getting out there and looking at these things and going looking for fossils and just having the time to think and also be away from social media for a minute. So that's most of my career, and I got into it because I was basically a struggling college student. So I was going to Rutgers University. This was in the early aughts, which now is like, that was only 15 years ago, my God. So I was at Rutgers. I was an ecology and evolution student. I liked the major, but the focus there was more on wetlands and forestry, which are very important. It just wasn't my thing. So in this moment of sort of frustration, I went to the university computer lab where you've got university access to all those wonderful books and papers and journals and things like that. And I started reading those books and papers to educate myself about paleontology. I loved it since I was a kid, but I didn't know the technical stuff. Most of what I knew came from news reports. I wanted to go basically to the source to find out what scientists were saying. And to help myself remember what I was learning, I would write about it. This is when blogs were really kind of on their way out for most general people, but science blogs were really starting to take off. So I started writing about paleontology and fossils, and over time, people said like, okay, you're pretty good. Like, why don't you do an op-ed? And then I did a book, and then I started writing for Smithsonian, and it kind of snowballed from there. So that in 2011, I moved out to Salt Lake City, where I am now, and became a freelance science journalist, and really just dove full into that career. So it's a little bit chaotic. I never know what I'm going to be doing from one week to the next. It really is dependent on like sort of the science that's coming out or what ideas I come up with. But a lot of this just developed out of my passion for fossils and trying to find this alternate route to allow me to engage with and talk about paleontology.
It's so wonderful. I mean, it's just, what would we do without, folks like David and you, Riley, to help us put out our science and interpret that in a way that we're both happy with it and the public really enjoys it too, because there's such a disconnect sometimes between us and the media.
Yeah, as far as I know, I'm the only sort of fossil focused journalist out there where like that's the prime aspect of my job. And I love it because I love bringing the sort of the expertise that I've developed, the ideas that like if I have a story and I know I need an outside comment, like, oh, I know who to talk to for this, and developing it's really about curiosity. It reminds me a bit of a part of a book by John Steinbeck called The Log from the Sea of Cortez, which is really a fascinating sort of science in the field book. So he goes on this big trip, like leaving Monterey Bay down to Baja California with Ed Ricketts, this legendary marine biologist. And at the beginning of the trip, as they make each port of call, they're like, we are here to study the intertidal communities. And people are just like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's not really interesting. But as soon as they start, there's they kind of like drop that and just said like, we're just curious. Like we're looking for stuff in tide pools. Like, have you seen anything weird? And people's like, oh yeah, I saw this weird thing the other day. I've got it in a jar at home, or I've got the shell of that thing. And they would respond much more strongly to that. And I think sometimes it's very easy when we're in this world to get like sort of into the nitty gritty and technical details. If you want to have a fight on social media, talk about whether tyrannosaurs have lips or not, because people will like jump on the technicalities of that when really what's underneath all this stuff is just curiosity. Like it's hard to look at a fossil, at least for me, whether it's a fragment of bone out in the field or a skeleton in a museum, and not wonder about what did that animal look like? What did it sound like? What were its behaviors like? How are my impressions of what it is maybe different from how it actually acted? The sort of intersection of imagination and what we're able to glean from science. And that's what drives so much of what I do.
Well, let's, if you're ready, we'll move on over to the presentation.
Right, yeah, certainly ready to get that screen share going. There we go, that look good for everybody?
Looks great, and we want to know what a Cronch cat is.
Yeah, so I put the cat in quotes because what the creature that I'm talking about today was originally identified as a cat. It was thought to be very cat-like, and it may have been a little bit cat-like. but we're not entirely sure. This was an animal that lived more than 46 million years ago, an animal called Patriaphilis, which means basically father cat. And I'll go into a little bit about how it got that name, what we think about its ecology, but really I picked this animal in particular because we have a great specimen here at the Natural History Museum of Utah. This is a picture of a cast of that specimen that's on display, but it's got a essentially complete cranium and a set of lower jaws. It has a fair bit of the vertebral column and some of its limbs, and it's just this gorgeous specimen. Like if this thing were a dinosaur, there'd be 10 papers about it, but because it's an Eocene mammal, it doesn't get studied quite so much. But when I was looking at it, it's like, this isn't just like anything that's around today. It's doing something different. It's doing something interesting. There's something about it that has a broader story to tell. So I'm going to go, that's what I'm going to go into during the time that we have. And this is a representation by Gabriel Ugueto that you can find as a Serpent Illis on Twitter. Prolific and fantastic paleo artist. Like, if you're not on Twitter and you love paleo art, you should get on there, because the number of people who are daily sharing the most amazing art you have ever seen are all on there. So this is a representation that he did for me, just as a little sketch of what it might, this animal, Patriofelis alta, might have looked like. So you can see it's kind of cat-like, but it's also a little bit bear-like. It's not exactly like anything that's around today. So where did we get this animal from? Like what started this story? It really goes back to the 19th century, during the era where the bone wars, as we know them in paleontology, were just getting going. And the key player in this early part of the story was Joseph Leidy. And he was a polymath who lived in Philadelphia, and he studied all sorts of stuff. Among other things, if you ever have like a ham steak for breakfast and there's not worms in it, which there shouldn't be, you have him to thank, because he first recognized that. He put his ham steak under a microscope and said, there are eggs in here, that's weird. And it led to a whole bunch of changes involving food safety. So I just share that anecdote to say, like, this was somebody, I think there's a book about him with the subtitle, The Last Man Who Knew Everything, which obviously is hyperbole, but like he really did get himself involved in various aspects of science and natural history, and paleontology was one of them. So there was a particular fossil that was sent back to him from Ferdinand Hayden from the Bridger, what we now know as the Bridger Formation. So that's about 2 hours by car east of where I'm sitting now, just across the Wyoming border, the beautiful part of the desert. And you find lots and lots of turtles, and you find lots and lots of mammals out there. And at the time, really, fossils were still so new to American paleontologists. You know, indigenous populations and people who've been roaming about the West were familiar with fossils and that they were out there, but there was no what we might call a scientific or academic understanding of these animals. They didn't have names. We didn't really know what they were, what they belonged to. So this jaw, once it made its way back to Leidy, he had a look at it, and it seemed to be something similar to cats or hyenas in its construction. Like, not all the teeth were complete. He didn't have the majority of the skull, but there was just something about it that said this is some kind of feliform kind of animal that's more or less like mountain lion size. And he gave it its name, Patriofelis alta. And this is that holotype specimen. This is now held at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. You can see that on the top fossil, on the left-hand side of the screen there, that's the condyle at the back of the jaw. Most of the teeth that are set in there are broken. But this was the age where, like, most naturalists who were describing these fossils, like, comparative anatomy was their jam. That's what they did. So when they found fossils like this, they would compare it to modern animals that they knew and kind of narrow down what it might possibly be. So at the time, our knowledge of animals from the Eocene, from this time period when Patriaphilis lived, was relatively minimal, was still coming together. So I think it was a pretty fair guess for the material that he had to work with. So I mentioned the Bone Wars era. So after Leidy, very quickly, you had these two other paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. One was based in New Haven, one was based in Philadelphia. They started out as friends. Most people know this story. If you're not familiar with the whole drama, there are plenty of books and articles and documentaries that you can look into. But basically, these two men started as friends, and then they became very bitter enemies. And they had this competition to basically see, it was informal, but see who could like name the most and who kind of could control the fossil record of the American West. So it got to the point where they were literally telegraphing in species description. So some of the original names for these things are academic journals that had to have debates about whether they could accept a new genus or species name sent in by telegraph as valid or not. And some journals didn't even want to basically publish papers about this competition between the two. The American Naturalist, I think, which Cope actually bought, said, like, if you're gonna just like attack Marsh in our pages, like we're not gonna publish it anymore. So even his own journal was kind of turning against him. It got so vociferous. Where Patriaphilis comes into this is a lot of the fossils that were being found in the Bridger Formation, the surrounding area, were going back east. Some were going to Marsh, some were going to Cope. Almost all of them were partial. So there was no complete skeleton of this animal that was being found, at least not initially. So they were getting all different kinds of names. So Limnophilis was one, Patriaphilis was another. Most of these are synonymous with certainly Patriaphilis, possibly Patriaphilis alta. There's some debate because this animal has not been extensively studied even now, whether there's a second species called Patriaphilis ferox. But basically, if you think of a skeleton, all the bones in the skeleton, and somebody gets part of the jaw, and somebody gets part of the hand, and somebody gets part of the vertebral column, that's why we have so many different names that eventually get all lumped together. It was really at the beginning of the 20th century. There was a particular specimen that went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City that was actually pretty good. Paleontologists, they were able to assemble more or less complete view of what this animal looks like, and that's what's on the bottom right of the screen is a skeletal restoration of what Patriaphilis looks like. And I think the reconstructed skeleton is still there, but it's taken off display. It's in the corridor somewhere. I haven't seen it myself, but I hope to. In any case, once we had this picture of what the animal actually looked like, it started to get a lot more interesting because the paleontologists who were studying it thought that it had some kind of semi-aquatic relationship, that this was an animal that was otter-like. There was one particular paleontologist who thought it might be a seal-like animal and relevant to the origin of pinnipeds back in the Eocene. So what you have on the top left there, that's the restoration by famed paleo artist Charles R. Knight, that has, you know, the top one kind of has a resting cat face kind of vibe to it. But they thought that this was a mountain lion-sized otter-like animal that even then they had this inkling that it was going around kind of crunching on armored prey, kind of living somewhat like a jaguar in places like the Pantanal in South America today. And that's what's depicted in this scene, especially if you see like the webbed toes in particular and that kind of overall otter-like form. They're trying to make Patriaphilis fit that. And if you have a look at the skeletons together, you can sort of see it. There are some major differences. For example, the cranium and jaws of Patriaphilis are much heftier. This is a lot more biting power being put behind it and not as much brain space. You can really see that smoothed, basically outer lobes of the back of the skull in the otter for how much more sort of a neocortex that animal had. If you look at the shoulder blades as well, on otter, they're much smaller. On Patriaphilis, they're much broader. Patriaphilis might have been plantigrade, so that means that its toes are basically touching the ground. His feet were more like a bear's in a way, whereas most cats and many feliforms and otters as well often digitigrade fashion, where they're kind of up on their toes. So if you're ever walking around and you're kind of standing on the balls of your feet, so just the toes are basically touching the ground, that's the equivalent of digitigrade. And when we come back down, the heel touches, that's plantigrade, if you're not familiar with those terms. So you can sort of see where they were going. There are some sort of overall resemblances from this, but this is a much heftier, much beefier kind of animal. And after that initial burst of scientific activity, we had basically silence for a number of years. There weren't enough specimens of this animal to really make it a great case study for understanding evolution of the fossil record. It didn't really seem to have any kind of relationship to animals living now. The seal idea and the otter idea kind of were shuffled off. The animals identified as being agreed on is basically belong to a group of extinct carnivorous animals called oxaenids. So during this time period, more than 46 million years ago, there were the ancestors of dogs and cats and hyenas and things, but they're relatively small. They were kind of like a pine marten or a civet, if you're familiar with those animals. The large carnivores of the time belonged to this group called Coreodonts, and Patriaphilis was one of them. And one of the best specimens, the specimen that really inspired me to look into this animal a bit more, was found in 1953. There was a fossil collector by the name of Golden York who was working in the Bridger Formation, basically outside of Kemmerer, Wyoming. So if you're familiar with the Green River Formation, or those little sort of fossil fish that are kind of almost golden colored on that very pale kind of tan or khaki slate, it's that area that they come from. This era where these broad lakes covered much of what's now the American West. And in this case, there was a basically complete cranium and the lower jaws, and basically what I described at the beginning, that this was a pretty good associated specimen. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact locality data. That was not often kept. I'd love to go and find where this thing was from, but at least we have some idea of the formation, the general area that this animal is coming from. And this is that skull. This is the actual fossil. It's in the NHMU collections. And you can tell immediately that it's not quite like a cat. If you look at the back of the skull, for example, you can see that ridge, that sagittal crest, where that's basically the top point for muscle attachment for those really huge jaw muscles, that basically big triangle of bone below that you can see that opening there on the side. Basically it's cheekbone, the equivalent of our zygomatic arch, how much space there is for those masseter muscles, for those jaw closing muscles to thread through, but there's not a lot of brain space. And this is something that even I think Marsh and his day recognized, that a lot of these Eocene mammals, that they had a different sort of brain anatomy setup than modern animals, that these were not just the equivalents of modern day cats and dogs. They're doing something a little bit different. And there's also that interesting little shelf to the nose. If you look at most cats, they almost have like a heart-shaped aperture at the front of their skulls for a nose. And this has this weird little kind of squared off shelf before it goes inside. And we'll get to the teeth in a minute, because even on this image, when you're not looking at it directly, that tooth looks a little bit stubby. And there's a reason for that. Oh, before I jump to that next part, here's a look at the entire skeleton, basically what we have from that. So there are a few vertebrae and articulation, a few ribs, elements of the hind limbs. There's actually been some recent studies on the postcrania of this animal and its flexibility, but no one to date has published very much about its jaw and what it was doing in its ecology since that study in the 1950s. So this is a view of the cast that's kind of mounted on a pole, but it's a pretty good and accurate cast. And you can see on this that those canines, those teeth at the front of the jaw, are incredibly worn. These are not breaks that happened after fossilization or during the excavation process. I'll have another angle in just a minute, but especially on those lower canines, those big rounded teeth, they're sticking out right at the bottom there. You can see how beveled down they are. They're polished smooth. So that's an indication of a kind of feeding style that we call durophagy. So basically eating hard stuff. So this thing, that's the reason I called it a crunch cat at the beginning, is this thing was crunching something. And we'll get into what that might be in a minute. But even without doing sort of an in-depth microwear analysis or isotopes, which would be very helpful, but just looking at this thing, you can tell like it is basically grinding its teeth or chewing things that are incredibly hard, to the point where you're getting these beveled edges against its teeth. And there's actually handedness to this, so you can really see this super well when you look at the dentary, when you look at the lower jaws. If you look on the left side, you can see how much more that tooth has been worn and smoothed down, and it's the same on the cranium as well, those upper canines. So this is a sign of what we call handedness, and that this animal seemed to prefer to chew stuff on the left side of its mouth. I'm actually really curious to see some of the other specimens to see if they have different handedness, so some of them preferred the right side. But even all along that tooth row, you can see this thing was kind of either grabbing or crunching into or chewing things preferentially on the left-hand side. And that tells us something about its behavior. You know, maybe it doesn't explain everything about what it's doing, but I kind of like that, especially in reconstructing these fossil animals. It adds a little bit of personality, that this was something that this particular animal was doing, you know, repeatedly throughout its life, and it gives it just that much more insight into its behavior. So what kind of environment was this animal in? What could have possibly been eating if we're going to consider its paleoecology? was found in the Bridger Formation, and Bridger Formation is perhaps most famous for Uintatherium. So this big, strange herbivore, we still don't really know exactly what it is. It's been described as any number of things, from a pachyderm to a relative of rabbits to its own clade, basically all together. So this herbivorous mammal that had these long saber fangs and these multiple knobs on top of its head. And it's more or less rhino size, but something unlike anything that we have alive today. And Patriaphilis is more or less in these same environments. And this is in the earlier part of the Eocene. We're talking about like 46 to 49-ish million years ago. And when you go out and do field work in places like this, you find a lot of turtles. On the left is another Charles R. Knight restoration that he did for the Field Museum in Chicago. I think it's still up there in their fossil halls. And on the right, even though it was a different formation, this is in the Uinta Basin, so it's a little bit geologically younger, but it's still Eocene, are various parts of turtle shell that I found during my trip out there earlier this summer. And I've been to the Bridger as well, and it's the same thing that, you know, you're walking along, you're prospecting, you're looking for fossils, and you find a busted up turtle. Okay, that's probably not worth collecting. I'm gonna keep walking and go about 100 feet, and you find another busted up turtle, and you go another 100 feet, and you keep finding these things. We had Howard Hutchinson, who was a very well-known turtle researcher, out with us, and he wanted to collect them all, and I'm like, look, wondering where in the world like the mammals are, because it's just turtles one on top of the other, just all the way through this formation. They're certainly abundant, and they're different varieties as well. Some of them were more tortoise-like, some were more like sort of soft-shelled turtles that we see around us today. So this big profusion of turtles, that this was definitely a sort of wet, lakeside, streamside kind of environment that this animal was wandering around. And in considering what Patriaphilis might have been doing, I was really struck by some of the superficial similarities to today's jaguars. The skull on the right-hand side, that is an Ice Age jaguar from Tulare, Peru. That's at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. The skull looks a little bit weird because the back of the skull is kind of tipped forward so that those frontals are angled down, like it's actually two big parts. And this animal is so big that it was initially identified as an American lion before people realized, like, actually, no, that's just a really big jaguar. And jaguars today are known amongst big cats for eating a lot of armored prey, armadillos, turtles, caimans. You've probably seen like the National Geographic videos of like a caiman on a riverbank, and the jaguar basically just comes out of the shallows, crunches into the back of its neck, and drags it back in. There's also a skull I should have included in this talk. I'm just realizing this now. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, in their fossil mammal holes around the sloths and the glyptodonts, there's the head of a glyptodont, so basically a giant armadillo, an armadillo the size of like a Mini Cooper, more or less, that has two punctures in the very top of its skull. And there's been some debate about whether that was caused by a saber-toothed cat or a jaguar. I think jaguar might be a little bit more likely given their habits, but these are cats in the fossil record and now that certainly don't have a problem with crunching into prey. They're not so much, I don't want to say that they're not hypercarnivores, because they certainly are, but they're not as wary as basically crunching into and through bone as other felids that we find in the modern fossil records. So I've wondered, like, maybe that is a decent modern analog. Maybe if we can look at the dental wear, both gross and in microscopic detail, of jaguars that we know come from areas where they eat a lot of turtles, where they eat a lot of armadillos, could that perhaps provide us with a modern analog or some clues about what Patriaphilis was doing? So this is kind of where it's at. I don't have a conclusion just yet. This is research that has yet to be done. This is just almost kind of like my pitch that this is something cool that should be looked into. But I think somewhere in this zone is where the ecology of Patriaphilis might have been. So you have that early conception by night where they're eating crocs. There's modern jaguars here represented by Bella the jaguar from the Reed Park Zoo in Tucson. I got to see her run around earlier this summer, which is great. And then Patriaphilis itself, which, you know, it could be that I'm completely wrong. It could be that this animal was cracking bones or chewing them. Like, I have a hypothesis to test, But that's the thing, you can't just look at a fossil and come to an immediate conclusion, not do any science. I've got something now to go look at the anatomy, to go look at the microwear to see if there are any equivalents. And it might be that this animal is doing something entirely unexpected or that we don't know. There's been a problem, I think, with Cenozoic paleontology historically, where, or at least, in the 20th century, I think we're getting out of it now, where you find a strange fossil mammal and it more or less resembles a lion or a rhino or just some animal that we're familiar with now. And in our restorations and reconstructions, the ancient animal kind of becomes the modern one in terms of its color patterns, in terms of what we think it was doing, when really the information that we want is in the fossils themselves, that we have all these modern clues that we can certainly bring to bear, and they're very, very important. But to not make assumptions like, oh, it's kind of cat-like, so I'll just make it like a cat. My hypothesis is that Patriaphilis is or was acting in a jaguar-like way, but I would love to also be proven wrong. So that's kind of where that is at. I'm happy to sort of button the lecture part of this up. If you're interested in what I do, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Laylaps. If you like this talk, you can buy me a coffee through the coffee link, or pick up one of my books. The Last Days of the Dinosaur will be coming out in April, and that one will be about if you were to stand in ancient Montana 66 million years ago, basically from the day before the asteroid struck through the million years that followed, what happened in the second, the day, the week, the month, the year, and so on, after that impact, releasing the ecosystem change. So there's certainly more to talk about, discuss, and dig into, and thank you so much for paying attention to this part of the talk.
All right, thank you, Riley. And we can go over to questions, David, if you're starting to have them come up. I have a couple that I'll go ahead and ask. And one of them is, I was trying to get a feel for the positioning of the eyes and whether or not they were basically more anteriorly located for depth perception, or were they more sort of pushed over to the side a little bit, therefore being a little bit unlike perhaps cats?
Yeah, let me share that slide again. And just as a reminder, my pronouns are she, her. So here's the skull. So I wish I had this is where talks online are a little bit different from talks in real life, because real life had a laser pointer to point this out.
Right.
But if you look at the orbits, it's very cat-like in that the area where the eye would be situated is open. So it's basically being held in there between the musculature and with the various ligaments, things like that. So based upon, let me see if I can get that front view. It does seem a little bit odd that they do seem widely spaced. This is basically a low, broad cranium, but I don't see any reason not to think that it wouldn't have binocular vision, basically like most other carnivorous and carnivorous animals. That depth perception would have been very important, and this is the kind of common inheritance of these various carnivorous lineages. So yeah, there's probably something a little bit different from a modern day jaguar or a modern day big cat in the positioning of where its eyes would be, at least from side to side, but I think they would have been oriented forward more than to the side.
I like the jaguar analogy. I think that, the broadness of the teeth and the musculature too that I'm seeing on the forearms reminds me a lot of jaguar. But what a cool looking animal from front on. There's just no frontal expansion going upward at all. And then you look at the size of the zygomatic, it must have had an incredibly powerful bite.
Right, which entirely tracks with what we're seeing on the teeth. And that's the interesting thing, that if these are specializations to durophagy, if these are specializations for crunching a lot of stuff, that obviously this evolved over some amount of time. So there must be earlier creodonts that have similar traits in a way that you might be able to track the evolution of this particular dietary adaptation. That this just didn't come out of nowhere. There must be sort of predecessors to this form that we have yet to identify. And I love that stuff in the fossil record, because once you identify that, you can start going back into collections and saying, well, maybe somebody already dug this up. Maybe we already have this somewhere. We just didn't know what it was yet.
So as you're on this slide, it looks like those teeth are just absolutely massive. And sometimes it's difficult for me to really wrap my brain around the size of some of these things. Kind of, so is this animal, and maybe you said it and I just missed it, but is this animal about the same size as a jaguar? Is it bigger? Is it just denser and more of a heavyweight? Can you kind of give us a picture of what this animal might have been if I was looking at it in a dark alley?
Yeah, if you're looking at it in a dark alley, it'd probably be about the size of a large German Shepherd, or if we're talking about cats, it's roughly about leopard sized, I would say. It doesn't have retractable claws like the cats do, but it doesn't have hoof-like sort of unguals like a Masonichid or something like that either. So it would probably look like a very stocky kind of cat. Let me go back to Gabriel's restoration at the very beginning, because I think that he got it pretty much close, that this animal probably had more of a plantigrade way of moving. It wasn't particularly agile, which is something else that might play into its ecology, that if it's eating a lot of hard stuff, if it's eating a lot of turtles, if it's eating a lot of bone, it probably doesn't have to move very fast. This is not a pursuit predator. It's really about bringing that power to bear on really hard food items. So it's kind of like a bear cat kind of thing. We have the amphicyonids, which are the bear dogs, and Patriaphilis is more of kind of a bear cat kind of thing.
All right, so we do have some questions coming in from the audience. I'll remind everybody at this point that if you have questions for Riley, please start sending them in now. You can leave them in the Facebook comments or send them over to Gray Fossil Site at Twitter or Instagram. I'll be keeping an eye there as well. Let's go with this first one. This is a question from Andrea. Is there any evidence of sexual dimorphism in Patriaphilis?
That's a great question. That's one of like our basic biology sort of questions, like how do you distinguish biological sexes in the fossil record? Unfortunately for this animal, we don't have enough of a sample size. Aside from the reconstructed skeleton at the AMNH, the one at the Natural History Museum of Utah is the only other one that I know of. I know there's additional fossils elsewhere, but to get at something like sexual dimorphism, that's something where if this were a modern animal, we could go into collections and look at study skins, or we could go into the wild and have a look at the animals and what they're doing out in their natural habitat. And we could study multiple individuals. In the fossil record, particularly with carnivores, large carnivores are usually rare. There's actually a great book called Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare that goes into the ecological reasons for this. But we just don't have all that many of them. So if our sample size is 2, it's probably not going to tell us very much. And in this case, oftentimes fossil mammals, our assumptions are made based upon what we know about modern animals in terms of sexual dimorphism. So if one individual seems bigger than another, it's often more likely to be assigned male than female. It doesn't seem like Patriaphilis had any particularly sexually dimorphic traits, so far as we can see, like no sort of ornamentation or decorations that could help us really tease out that difference. It's not like in non-avian dinosaurs where some females have medullary bone, the special like egg-laying bone tissue that we can look at. So really we would need like a whole bunch of Patriaphilis that we had some idea that they were the same age when they died, not geologic age, but individual age, to make sure that we're comparing like to like, and then basically plot that out. See, like for example, this has been done with the saber-toothed cat Smilodon, looking at their lower jaw. Is there a sort of this bimodal distribution with these 2 peaks? If we plot everybody's basically like jaw size or body size out on a graph, do they create these 2 clusters that we would expect to be different sexes? Or is it just kind of scattered throughout, in which case we wouldn't expect very much sexual dimorphism? So that's a great question that I would love to know more about, but we'd have to find so many fossils. I'd love to find them, but that might be something that remains a mystery for quite some time, unless we come across something very unexpected. For example, if we come across a Patriaphilis skeleton that has an embryo inside, sometimes you find embryonic bones in some of these skeletons, or basically the fetus of a Patriaphilis that was preserved inside its mother. And then we could look at other skeletons, say, okay, are there distinguishing characteristics? We now have an example of a female. Can we distinguish that based upon other ones? So, the fossil records is full of surprises. I would never say never, but sexual dimorphism is an extremely difficult thing to get at. I think the further you go back in time and the more distant you get from modern animals.
Cool. Oh man, a pregnant Patriaphilis. How cool would that be?
I mean, that's the paper title right there. I love it.
Right. Here's another question. This one is from Aaron, who's one of our ETSU alumni. Aaron asks, are P. ulta and P. ferox synonymous with each other?
That's a great question. I don't think anyone has gone back to look at the systematics. My suspicion is that they are, because both names come from this era where everybody was just naming a whole bunch of stuff and it was recognized to at least belong to the same genus. But because this animal seems to be relatively rare and hasn't been studied in depth, I'm guessing that the individual variation probably crosses over into that species boundary. But then again, it would be worth looking at whether P. ulta and P. ferox bones are coming from different geological levels or different geographical locations, really putting all that together. So I'm more of an ecologist than a systematist, but this is another example of an animal that is certainly, ripe to be looked at. Again, that there's something there, and at least it's much less of a headache than some animals from that era, like the dinosaur Camarasaurus. There have been so many species named and stuff where it's like it'd take years to untangle all that. So at least this would be a relatively easy one. So we don't have an answer to that, but I suspect that those two species are probably synonymous. And since P. ulta is what we have sort of a better, I think, skeletal representation of, that's the one that I tend to lean on the side of, and that's the one that Leidy named first, so it'd have priority if they turn out to be synonyms.
Gotcha. All right. Once again, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to ask. While we're waiting, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So we're talking about this animal as potentially being a, durophagy specialist, eating hard stuff. And I know that over the history of Cenozoic mammals, there have been a bunch of different groups that have sort of capitalized this. You've got your Barophagenes, bone-crushing dogs. Today, of course, you have your hyenas. Where does this fall in sort of time and space relative to those other groups? Would this, if Patriaphilis is bone crunching, if it is a durophagous specialist, would it be competing with some of those others? Could it be a predecessor of some of those? How does it fit in there?
Yeah, so during its time, its primary competition would be other creodonts and Masonichids, so what are sometimes called wolves with hooves, this totally extinct group of carnivorous mammals that instead of claws at the end of their feet is this hoof-like kind of ungule at the end of it. So those were the large carnivorous mammals at the time. None of them were super huge. None of them were getting to polar bear size or anything just yet. But they're all in that sort of like mountain lion size, large wolf size zone. But none of them seem to show the specialization that Patriaphilis does. And what seems to distinguish Patriaphilis, I think, from modern carnivores, other Cenozoic carnivores that I've certainly been fascinated by and looked at, is that most of the tooth wear is actually at the front of the jaw in the canines and some of the incisors. There is wear along those cheek teeth, but if you look at the tooth wear of something like a spotted hyena, for example, you've got that pyramidal premolar, and that's the main bone crunching tooth, the one that tends to get pretty worn down. And they're grabbing and manipulating things with the front of the jaw, but they're doing most of the crushing with the back of the jaw. Patriaphilis, most of the tooth wear seems to be at the front, and that's where most of the sort of damage to the tooth is being done. So to me, that suggests that it's doing something a little bit different, that it's manipulating or biting into prey or food items in such a way that isn't necessarily comparable to a lot of the carnivores that we're familiar with that use that carnassial shear, that kind of like scissor-like arrangement of teeth to really break things down in their jaws, where they grab and then they sort of crunch on the side in a way that's probably familiar to us. Patriaphilis was doing something entirely different. So I wonder if to some degree this is niche partitioning or specialization as a result of there being other large carnivores on the landscape. Other creodonts are certainly found in the same formation, but its relationship to them were there things that were more sort of pursuit predators or ambush predators, and Patriaphilis represents sort of something that was relying on a different food source We don't entirely know the answer to that, but that's certainly something that's part of this story and worth pursuing, the sort of the question of why. Why was it doing what it did once we get established sort of what it was eating? Then what drove it to that particularly dietary niche that seems so familiar but also unprecedented in the history of Cenozoic mammals?
Yeah, I keep looking at this, Riley, and it's striking. It's so remarkably specialized. And here we are in the Eocene, and the size of the canine, and then the next incisor over is absolutely massive as well. And then it only has one more, it looks like incisors. So 2 incisors on the upper than the canine, which is so specialized and unlike cats or bears in that way.
Yeah, that's part of that story, is like looking back a little bit older to see in the lower levels of the Bridger Formation, or possibly even the Paleocene, are there animals that start to show this kind of specialization, especially because we know that turtles and crocs and a lot of these sort of armored freshwater environment sorts of vertebrates were some of the great survivors of the KPG mass extinction. So if they were proliferating, it would kind of make sense to me that like during this heyday of turtles and caimans and crocs and things, that you had a predatory animal that became specialized on that. But again, that's just, you know, sort of spitballing a hypothesis.
Any plans to do like finite element analysis to look at bite force?
Not FEA, because I'm not as familiar with that. There is, I think, part of the problem with FEA analyses is that we're usually looking just at the bare bones, literally, that we make a model of the skull and we're not including the soft tissues and things that might have buttressed or buffeted or like sort of assisted in the various aspects of what this animal is doing. I think the place to start that I'm looking at is you know, sort of taking a more scientific look, a more technical look at the tooth wear beyond just what you can see, to see if there are any micro wear signatures that are familiar, and to see if like eating turtles versus eating bone, which kind of is the same thing because turtles are encased in their kind of bone, but if there's something there. And I wonder if there's something in the isotopes in the teeth that would require a consumptive analysis to see like, okay, where's this thing plotting out in comparison to other carnivores and other animals in its ecosystem. I think there are lots of different tools to bear. So I think FEI might be able to tell us something, but I think that's been one of the issues with FEA in general in paleo studies, is that it can kind of give us an overall direction, but too often like we're not including the soft tissues that would affect those values that we're getting out on the other side.
Yeah, it's just so, the more I think about it, the more your hypothesis is just really, really interesting, because, well, we might not have a good analog. I mean, the jaguar being an analog, but this might be such a neat specialization here that this was sort of optimizing in using that front bite in a way for turtles that we just don't get to see today in anything.
Yeah, and there's another animal that doesn't seem to be as predatory, but that also has very large, very thick, I don't want to say overdeveloped, that feels like a very 19th century thing to say, but very prominent front teeth, called Stylinodon, that's found out in the Uinta Basin out here in Utah. And it's kind of like, if I don't want to say a beaver, it's like, it's almost like a cross between a beaver and a bear, but with teeth that are more like Patriaphilis, with these very large, very thick, almost banana-like teeth, with these large claws on the foot, but it doesn't seem to be a predatory animal. It seems to be more of an herbivorous animal. I think the hypothesis up until now is that it's been looking for, like, it might dig, that might be looking for like roots or underground storage food items. But that's another one that we've known this animal for a while, but we really don't know what it's doing or why it looks the way that it does. It's just another Cenozoic oddball that's kind of just like waiting on the shelf. So it's like, if any of you listening are paleontology students or interested in study subjects, like the early Eocene is rife with these like gorgeous skeletons that nobody is looking at. And they're certainly worth like taking a peek at.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking too, is the Eocene in general is just, it's like landing on Mars. You know, it is just so strange and surreal when you look at some of these forms. Now you got me thinking about isotopes. they're old enough that it'd be tough to get things like collagen and nitrogen isotopes out of them. But now that we've got, zinc isotopes, there's a lot of potential there. It'd be really neat to see Eocene food webs put together, I think.
Absolutely. And I like the point you made, where it's kind of like landing on another planet, in that if you went back to the time period that Patriaphilis was around, or if you went to the fossil lake environments, similar time period, different formation, but kind of that same vibe, you might think that you just got transported to a swamp somewhere in the southeast or something for a minute, that you would see alligators that kind of look familiar, and be bats and birds and fish and things that look kind of familiar. And then like a Uintatherium would like crash out of the bushes, or you'd see something like Patriaphilis. So it's like there's this very familiar kind of smaller vertebrate fauna and insect fauna and plant fauna that look very, very much modern, but mammals were doing all these strange and wonderful things. And like you said, like reconstructing these food webs, we have the taxon lists, but understanding the ecology of how this all worked together is something that it's still, I think, a range of studies that's still very much in its infancy, in its beginnings. We're getting a good idea of like the climate of the time, whether mammals got bigger or smaller as climate change made things hotter during the PETM, this great heat spike that happened about 55 million years ago. But in terms of just their functional ecology and their diets and their niches, we don't know very much about it. Like, again, I mentioned even Uintatherium, this animal that's so iconic, that's like this representative, not just of the bone wars, but the Eocene in general. Like so many museums just have it because it looks so weird. We don't even know where to place it on the mammalian family tree. And we have all these beautiful skulls and skeletons. So there's a lot of this stuff that, has yet to be poked into. As much as I love Mesozoic stuff, I could probably spend like the rest of my career just poking at Eocene things and barely make a dent at it.
It's funny, we have talks like this one that are really fascinating and really interesting, and just over and over again I hear Chris and Blaine get to the end of these talks and go, man, I'd really like to look into, and it just feels like Paleo Talks is making this huge pile of projects for our paleontologists to get involved in.
Well, that's the thing, right? It's like you pull at that one thread, or you have an idea, and then it leads to one thing, and it leads to the next thing, and then it leads to something else. And that's the great part of this, right? Is like a single bone or a single specimen. You can ask so many questions about that, about the animal's biology, its ecology, how it related to other species, its evolution, its systematic. I love all the different views that you can have basically of the same creature or of the same environment. And there's so much to find that even if tomorrow we said like we have uncovered all the relevant fossils that we want to find, we've found every single like good specimen to study, the fossil record is now empty, it would still take us to the sun burns out to like understand anything about all of it, much less like through time. And I think we throw a lot of these numbers and figures out there, pretty casually, because we have to. It's just like the nature of our work. But when I say this animal lived more than 46 million years ago, think about how much time it would take you to just count to a million, much less 46 million, and how long ago that actually was, and how different life was at the time. There's so much hidden within that. Or even if we constrain this to like 1 million years, that is a long, long time with a lot of change. So I really can't, that's why I'm in the field that I'm in. And just every week there's just something else that in some large or small way like blows my mind about the past and what we're learning about it.
Yeah, wow. My mind is just like, I get so focused on the late Cenozoic, and you've introduced me to something that truly looks like an alien carnivore. And it's just, I'm going to be thinking about this for quite a while. So thank you.
Oh, of course, happy to. And that's one of the reasons I love the early parts of the Cenozoic. The late Cenozoic is obviously great, wonderful, and much more interesting than I think a lot of people understand. Obviously you all do, but it kind of breaks my heart when I go to a fossil museum and I go to like the mammal hall and it's so quiet, and I just kind of want to like drag people out of the Mesozoic ones, like, oh, look at this thing, we don't even know what it is. But I love that early part of the Cenozoic where you have so many predecessors of creatures and organisms that are alive today. Some things are very familiar, but then again, you had this whole radiation, this whole burst of mammalian evolution that filled all these niches that are familiar, but in entirely different ways, or sort of that have no connection to animals that are alive now, or it's sort of, it was almost like, not that there's any intention to this, I'm just using poetic license, but sort of like nature's first attempt at dogs and cats and bears, and then all those things go extinct, and then sort of the ancestors of those groups that have been waiting in the wings, more or less, get to proliferate, and this kind of back and forth. And it makes me wonder, obviously I will not be here to see it, but 50 million years from now, what life will look like, and sort of what creatures are going to pop up, and sort of what success stories are going to remain successful and which are going to fade away. It's just, it really puts it in perspective, like what our present moment in time, how different life used to be.
Wonderfully said.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. It's great to have writers on this show. That actually brings kind of, and I don't know if Blaine and David have more questions, but I have one question, and that kind of ties back to that. So Riley, you're coming to paleontology and to research kind of from a direction that is both very similar to the direction that many of us have come, a passion about fossils and that sort of thing, but academically also very different. Do you wear these different hats? Or do you wear a researcher hat and a writer hat? Is it just all the same thing? You come to it with that same curiosity? I mean, you obviously do, but how does one feed into the other? Can you articulate that at all?
Yeah, I think part of it has come from, it's not just my fascination with fossils, but like I really want to know these basic questions about what these animals were doing and how they lived, and all those different pieces. You just have to really visualize them to really kind of bring them to life in my imagination. Even if I'm totally off the mark, it's like it's still an attempt to do so. And I think it's the same across both. It's just the language being used. One is more technically structured and sort of thinking about how do you make an argument? How do you support that argument? How do you basically rule out other competing hypotheses, and sort of that framework, the process of science, where as if I'm writing, those things are all still in my mind. If I read a paper and I say, well, that's an interesting finding, but they didn't rule out like this, this, and this actually is not well supported, I do my best. I don't always succeed, but I do my best to try and identify those things and then ask about those things directly, or get a different take on it. So I think it's learning to think like a scientist, but to sort of let the poetry come out a little bit when expressing it. And I think they complement and feed into one another. And I love the fact that writing about so many different topics and time periods has helped me in the field as well. So this past summer, when I was out in the Uinta Basin, I was out with Beth Townsend and her group for the Uinta Basin Paleo Project. So this big Eocene project trying to understand climate change. In a sense, there's this period in like the middle late Eocene that mimics what we're going through now from human causes. So we're documenting all these fossil sites and trying to tie which species are occurring at which levels, more or less get an idea of the ecology through time. And the first day, I hop out of the truck, I get my backpack on, I get ready to look for fossils, and I'm thinking about bones. And I go down to the outcrop, and the first thing that I see are trace fossils, basically invertebrate burrows, these little squiggles that go down through the rock. And I found this chunk, and I look up trying to figure out where it came from. And just there's this entire sandstone, basically, not even a cap, but the sandstone layer that's going all around the basin that I'm in. And it's just so full of these. And I took it over to Beth and said, hey, you've got like a ton of trace fossils here. Like, is that something interesting? And it's like, you know what? I never would have thought of that. I never would have picked it up because they were in the mindset of looking for bones. And that's not a critique on their part, but more the only reason I was able to recognize what that was is because I've worked in other time periods and I've written about papers involving fossils like this. So even though I'm not an academic, even though I'm not a professional paleontologist, and I only have a handful of papers that are mostly historical, what I learned from writing about papers, most of the time it sticks. And I try and piece that stuff together, whether I'm in the field or whether I'm writing, to try and make some of these connections. And it's actually meant a lot to me that some of the things that I write have been used at places like La Brea for training volunteers, or I've had some paleontologists say that they read my articles so they don't have to actually read the paper. I'm like, well, you should also do that too. But like, I appreciate the vote of confidence that I'm trying to express basically like what's important about this particular study or conclusion. So I think the two of them, even though they're different and they involve different forms of language and expression, that the base curiosity and that thought about, okay, what is this? How do we test this? How do we figure it out? It's always there in the background, even if it's not apparent in the end result.
Yeah, and as an avid reader, I that is one of my favorite parts about the things that you write is that you are kind of approaching it not necessarily from this highly critical standpoint, but just from how do we test it and does it withstand kind of some questioning. So thanks. That's cool. We're glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you. Always happy to be here. I'm really thankful that you invited me to talk. It's just good to talk fossils. Like it's just fun to look at something. This reminds me of when I go to fossil halls. I usually like to go with friends, or when I went to the La Brea asphalt seeps a couple of months ago, I took my girlfriend's family with me, and I just like everything that I know about that particular animal or that reconstruction or its history or all this things, like it just comes spilling out. And that's the great thing about paleo, is that you're able to just like nerd out and wonder about stuff. Is that sense of wonder that I feel like drives so much of it. So in just everything I do, I want to capture that in some respect, whether it's like I wonder what's over the next hill and I might find over there, or like I wonder what this means. For example, there's a story I wrote, I think it was early this year. Time is so weird right now. It's like from the perspective of deep time, this is but a moment, but still, is about direwolves and genetics. And let me just stop my screen share here because it says my camera's off, so I don't know what's going on. Basically, the direwolves are not wolves in the traditional respect, that they last shared a common ancestor about 5 million years ago, but there's something different. So all these assumptions that we made about direwolves, we need to go back and re-examine, because we can't just say like, oh, it's probably like a gray wolf. It probably did the exact same thing. There's some things are probably very similar because the convergence is just so close. But I love that there's this assumption that's been made for like over 150 years. Turns out that we got it wrong. And now we have all these other questions to go back and ask. I love that.
Did we lose Riley?
No, just a frozen camera.
Yeah, let me see if I can stop and
Okay.
start it.
Well, we
Okay.
are about at the time we should wrap up anyway. So this is if we're going to have technical issues, now's the time for it.
Well, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Riley, so much for joining us. And thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing in paleontology and science. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you so much. This was so much fun. It was such a pleasure.
All right. Well, go ahead and stop it there, David.
All right. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, for asking questions, and we will be back for the next Paleo Talks before too long.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.